Picture this. It's a crisp autumn afternoon in 2022. Graduate student Rhea Langley is volunteering at the State Archive NX in Richmond, Virginia. Her hands dusty from handling centuries-old documents. She's doing what thousands of students before her have done, cataloging forgotten pieces of America's past. Yellowed land charters, faded colonial borders, the mundane paperwork of history. But then she finds something that shouldn't exist. Buried beneath stacks of census rolls, in an unmarked box that someone clearly wanted forgotten, lies a single hand-drawn map. The ink has faded to the color of dried blood. The parchment crackles like autumn leaves under her careful touch. And at the center, marked in precise red ink that seems to pulse even after all these years, are 5 words that will haunt her dreams. Bellhaven Institute for Wayward Girls. Established. The problem: there's no record of this place, anywhere. No academic references, no historical registries, no mention in any database she can access. According to every official source, Bellhaven Institute never existed, but someone took great care to draw this map. Someone circled it in red ink that bled into the parchment like a warning, and someone buried it so deep that it took 6 shred years for anyone to find it again. Today we're going to uncover why. What Rhea discovered that day wasn't just a map. It was evidence of one of America's most carefully erased chapters. A story of missing children, systematic abuse, and institutional cover-ups that reaches back to the darkest period of our nation's history. A story that powerful people spent generations trying to bury. But here's the thing about truth. It has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. The coordinates on that map point to Monroe Hollow, a patch of Virginia state forest that locals have avoided for over a century. They call it the Old Dark Patch, a place where nothing grows quite right, where the air feels heavier than it should, where even the most seasoned hikers report an overwhelming urge to turn back. What they don't know, what nobody was supposed to know, is that beneath the forest floor lie the foundations of an institution that operated for over 30 years, an institution that accepted dozens of young girls through its iron gates. Girls whose families believed they were sending them to a place of moral correction and spiritual guidance. Girls who were never seen again. To understand how Bellhaven came to exist, we need to step back into the America of The country was fracturing. War drums echoed across the landscape as tensions between North and South reached a boiling point. In the rural communities of Virginia, traditional social structures were crumbling under the weight of economic uncertainty and moral panic. It was an era when society didn't know what to do with girls who didn't fit the mold. Girls who asked too many questions. Girls who refused to be silent. Girls whose very existence challenged the rigid expectations of feminine propriety that held communities together. Orphanages were overcrowded. Families were desperate. And into this chaos stepped a woman whose charismatic presence and radical theology would attract followers from across the region. Her name was Calvina Moore, and she had a solution. Calvina Moore's story begins on the battlefields of the Civil War, where she served as a field nurse. Those who knew her during this period described a woman of extraordinary competence and unwavering faith. She could perform surgery without flinching. She could comfort dying soldiers with a voice that seemed to carry divine authority. She could work 18-hour days in conditions that broke seasoned physicians. But something happened to Calvina Moore in those blood-soaked fields, something that changed the very foundation of who she was. She returned to Monroe Hollow in early 1858, months before the war officially began, carrying with her a new theology that would attract followers and funding from across Virginia. She spoke of visions, of a martyred child saint named Araminta, who had been purified through suffering, of a divine calling to save young girls from the corruption of the flesh. Her sermons, first delivered in the ruins of an abandoned tobacco barn, drew crowds that grew larger each week. Ministers traveled from Richmond to hear her speak. Judges nodded in agreement as she outlined her philosophy of moral correction. Wealthy families opened their purses to fund her vision. What they were funding was the construction of Bellhaven Institute for Wayward Girls. From the moment the first stone was laid, Bellhaven looked wrong. Local workers who helped construct the building reported an atmosphere of unease that seemed to emanate from the very blueprint. The windows were too narrow, barely wider than arrow slits in a medieval fortress. The walls rose higher than any residential building in the county, creating the impression of a prison rather than a school. The chapel's steeple, meant to reach toward heaven, twisted at an unnatural angle that made it visible for miles around. But it wasn't just the external appearance that disturbed those who saw it. The internal layout defied logic and comfort. Dormitories were built without adequate ventilation. Corridors formed maze-like patterns that confused visitors, and beneath the main structure, accessible only through hidden doors, lay chambers that served no educational purpose whatsoever. The building materials themselves told a story of deliberate isolation and intimidation. The pale limestone walls, rumored to have been carved from a ruined convent north of Roanoke, seemed to glow with an sickly luminescence under moonlight. The iron gates bore the institution's motto etched in Latin, Fiat lux in tenebrae, let there be light in the darkness. But as any Latin scholar will tell you, that phrase carries deeper implications than its English translation suggests. It speaks of light not as comfort, but as exposure, not as warmth but as harsh revelation. It promises illumination that burns away everything you thought you knew about yourself. The women who came to staff Bellhaven arrived from across the South, drawn by Calvina's promises of serving a divine purpose. They shed their birth names upon arrival, adopting titles that revealed the true nature of their mission: Sister Silence, Sister Mercy, Sister Vow, Sister Grief. These weren't traditional nuns bound by conventional religious order. They were something new, something designed specifically for the work they would perform within Bellhaven's walls. They walked barefoot through winter snow. They covered every mirror in the institution, believing that reflection led to vanity and self-obsession. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, and their movements carried the deliberate precision of women who had been trained to break spirits without leaving visible marks. Sister Mercy, who served as the institution's head of medicinal care, maintained detailed records of her work, records that wouldn't be discovered until salvage teams combed through the ruins more than a century later. These documents, water-stained and partially burned, reveal a systematic approach to psychological mutilation that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychiatry for decades. She experimented with combinations of laudanum, mercury chloride, and herbal compounds designed to induce hallucinations and memory loss. She developed therapeutic treatments that left girls glassy-eyed and trembling at the sound of their own name. She perfected techniques of sensory deprivation that could reduce a defiant child to a silent shell within days. And she documented it all with the clinical detachment of a researcher recording the behavior of laboratory animals. At the heart of Bellhaven's operations lay a handwritten manuscript that would make even modern scholars of psychological abuse recoil in horror. The Law of Light, bound in stretched lambskin and chained to a pedestal in the chapel's east wing, contained 27 rules that governed every aspect of the girl's existence. These weren't simple behavioral guidelines. They were carefully crafted psychological weapons designed to strip away identity, independence, and hope. A quiet girl is a lighted path. A full belly makes the spirit heavy. Who bleeds must bathe in prayer. Each rule carried not just expectation, but consequence. Breaking any rule didn't result in traditional punishment. It triggered what Calvina called reflections of Aramenta, a system of correction that treated defiance as spiritual sickness requiring increasingly invasive treatment. The girls woke each morning at 4:33 a.m., not 4:30 or 4:45, but precisely 4. To be late by even 30 seconds meant spending hours kneeling in what the sisters called the ash cellar, a basement room, where the remains of previous punishments had been scattered across the floor. Breakfast consisted of thin broth or dry oats, portions calculated to maintain basic physical function, while inducing the psychological effects of chronic hunger. The children were forbidden from speaking until noon prayer, creating an atmosphere of oppressive silence broken only by the soft footsteps of the sisters and the distant sound of wind through the twisted spire. But perhaps most insidiously, the girls were actively discouraged from using their birth names. New arrivals were assigned virtue names: obedience, grace, stillness, dust, that served to sever their connection to their former identity. Some girls forgot their real names within months, responding only to the labels their captors had imposed upon them. When behavioral modification through hunger, sleep deprivation and social isolation proved insufficient, Bellhaven employed more direct methods of psychological destruction. The institution's 3 correction chambers were designed to break specific aspects of a child's resistance to institutional control. The Room of Light served as an introduction to advanced correction technique. Girls were locked in a closet lined with mirrors and illuminated by gas lamps that burned continuously. The mirrors had been positioned to create infinite reflections, forcing the confined child to see herself from every angle, while reciting verses of self-condemnation. The heat from the lamps made the small space stifling, while the constant illumination prevented sleep and induced hallucinations after prolonged exposure. Records indicate that girls typically spent between 6 and 18 hours in the room of light, depending on the severity of their perceived infraction. Those who emerged often displayed symptoms that we would now recognize as acute psychological trauma: trembling, difficulty making eye contact, and an compulsive need to seek permission before performing even basic actions. The room of silence represented an escalation in corrective intensity. This soundproof stone cell, carved into the institution's foundation, contained no windows, no furniture, and no source of light. Girls confined here experienced complete sensory deprivation, while subsisting on minimal water and no food. The isolation was so complete that many emerged with no clear sense of how much time had passed. One surviving account describes a girl who spent 6 days in the room of silence, and emerged with a chunk of her own hair missing, and the word ash scratched into her forehead. The scratches appeared to have been made with fingernails, suggesting that she had carved the word into her own flesh during her confinement. She never spoke again, and her name was subsequently removed from all institutional records. But it was the third chamber that revealed the true depths of Bellhaven's systematic cruelty. The Room of Fire was never described directly in any recovered documentation. References to it appear only in coded language, abbreviated notations, and the terrified whispers of girls who never experienced it themselves but had watched others disappear into its depths. What we know comes from architectural evidence and the scattered recollections of survivors interviewed decades after Bellhaven's destruction. The chamber was located in the deepest part of the institution's foundation, accessible only through a series of hidden passages that began behind the chapel's altar. Unlike the other correction chambers, the Room of Fire wasn't designed for temporary punishment. It was designed for permanent resolution of what Calvina's writings refer to as irremediable cases, girls whose resistance to correction indicated spiritual corruption too deep for earthly intervention. The process that led to the Room of Fire followed what Calvina called the triad of refinement. Girls who repeatedly violated institutional rules were first subjected to isolation, then sensory deprivation, then what she termed sacred guidance, a euphemism for psychological techniques that modern experts would classify as torture. Those who survived the first 2 stages but continued to display defiance were marked in the institutional ledgers with a specific symbol, a pile of. This designation meant that the child was no longer suitable for earthly correction, and required what Calvina's doctrine called return to light by private right. Among the dozens of children who passed through Bellhaven's gates, one story stands out for its documentation, and its testimony to the human spirit's capacity to resist even the most systematic attempts at destruction. Leah arrived at Bellhaven in the spring of 1865, 9 years old and carrying nothing but a frayed satchel and a small hand mirror wrapped in cloth. Her intake form, preserved in water-stained ledgers discovered after the institution's destruction, identified her simply as orphan, unrepentant, mother deceased by self-infliction, refuses prayer. From her first day at Bellhaven, Leah represented everything the institution was designed to eliminate. She refused to answer to the virtue named stillness, assigned to her. She stood during prayers rather than kneeling. She met the sisters' attempts at intimidation with a level stare that seemed to challenge the very foundations of their authority. What made Leah particularly dangerous to Bellhaven's system was not open rebellion that could be punished and potentially correct. Instead, she practiced a form of passive resistance that exposed the arbitrariness of the institution's rules. She would follow instructions precisely while somehow making her compliance feel like mockery. She would recite required verses, word for word, while making it clear that she remained fundamentally unchanged by the experience. Sister Mercy wrote in her clinical notes that Leah was too intact, and that grace will not penetrate. This wasn't a spiritual assessment. It was a psychological evaluation indicating that traditional methods of behavioral modification were proving ineffective. Leah's resistance manifested in small but significant ways that challenged the institution's control over its inmates. She kept her small mirror hidden in her bedding, using it not for vanity but as a tool for maintaining her sense of individual identity. She carved messages into hidden spaces throughout the building, leaving evidence of her continued existence for others to find. Most significantly, she began keeping a secret journal. The discovery of Leah's journal provides our most detailed first-hand account of daily life within Bellhaven, written on scraps of paper torn from prayer books and communion notices. The entries were hidden behind a loose stone in the chapel wall where they remained undiscovered for over a century. The journal entries reveal a child's perspective on systematic abuse,
but they also document Leah's remarkable ability to maintain her sense of self, despite relentless pressure to surrender her identity. Today the soup had something in it, I didn't tell. This simple observation reveals Bellhaven's practice of drugging the children's food with compounds designed to induce compliance and disorientation. Leah's decision not to report this discovery demonstrates her understanding that complaint would result in punishment rather than protection. She made Ruth sing with no tongue. She says her silence is brighter now. This entry refers to another girl whose defiance resulted in physical mutilation disguised as spiritual correction. The phrase brighter silence reflects the institution's rhetoric that presented the elimination of self-expression as spiritual enlightenment. They said the light doesn't hurt if you're clean. I'm tired of clean. Here, Leah reveals her understanding that Bellhaven's definition of cleanliness required the complete surrender of individual will. Her exhaustion reflects not physical fatigue, but psychological weariness from constantly resisting attempts to erase her personality. There's a room under the church. It eats the loud ones. I think it tried to eat me, but I bit back.
This entry provides our first documentation of the chamber system from a victim's perspective. Leah's metaphor of eating accurately captures the way the institution consumed the identities of children who challenged its authority. Her claim to have bit back suggests that she somehow survived an experience in one of the deeper chambers. The journal's final entries show increasing desperation as Leah realizes that her continued resistance is drawing dangerous attention. I saw the bell move. No one pulled the rope. It moved on its own. She says I'm too hard to fix. She says I'm ash with eyes. If you find this, I'm probably not. But Ruth saw the door open. That means somebody hears. I hope it's God. Or a woman. On October 15, 1865, the largest of Bellhaven's 3 bells rang for the first and only time in the institution's history. The sound, described by survivors as a deep, blunt, metallic groan, echoed through the building and into the surrounding forest, awakening every person within a mile radius. The bells had been cast from melted weaponry donated by local families and named Aramenta. According to institutional doctrine, they were meant to ring for specific occasions. Arrival of new girls, spiritual restoration of existing inmates, and what was euphemistically called eternal silence for cases requiring ultimate intervention. The bells had remained motionless for 7 years, leading some children to whisper that they were fake or cursed. But on that October night, Aramenta III, the largest and darkest of the 3, tolled once with such force that its vibrations cracked windows throughout the building. By morning, Leah's bed had been removed from the dormitory, not just emptied, completely dismantled, with the mattress burned and the wall behind it scrubbed bare. No announcement was made about her disappearance. When other children asked where she had gone, Sister Mercy simply stated that she chose silence and that this choice should be honored. A new rule appeared on the chapel bulletin board that week. Let not the unbent remain where pride clings. Purging must follow. The message was clear. Children who refused to submit to institutional control would face the same fate as Leah. But unknown to the sisters, Leah had prepared for this possibility. Hidden throughout the building were small acts of defiance that would outlast her physical presence. Carved into the underside of a prayer bench, barely visible beneath layers of wax and splinters, were 7 words that challenged the institution's narrative. I didn't choose silence. They made it. Not all adults at Bellhaven participated willingly in its systematic destruction of children. Among the sisters was one woman, whose conscience could not be silenced by religious rhetoric or institutional pressure. She arrived in 1862, listed in staff records only as Miriam of the Blue, a reference to her faded navy habit that stood out among the regulation slate grey worn by other sisters. Unlike her colleagues, Miriam's vow of silence was personal rather than institutional, chosen in response to her brother's death in the war rather than imposed by Bellhaven's rules. Miriam brought with her experience that the other sisters lacked. Before the war, she had trained in field medicine under her father, a Union Army doctor. She had delivered babies in makeshift hospitals, treated soldiers with wounds that would kill them slowly, and learned to recognize the difference between healing and harm. This medical background allowed her to observe Bellhaven's operations with a clinical eye that penetrated the institution's religious justifications. She recognized the symptoms of systematic drugging in the children's glassy stare. She identified the psychological techniques being used to induce learned helplessness and identity dissociation. Most importantly, she understood that what was happening at Bellhaven wasn't correction. It was deliberate psychological destruction. Miriam began documenting the atrocities she witnessed, but she couldn't risk written records that might be discovered. Instead, she developed a complex system of fabric-based communication. She stitched messages into pillow seams where only the girls would find them. Your name is... The pain is not your fault. There is someone watching. She marked the inner hems of the children's clothing with symbols that tracked their condition. A broken loop for illness. A tight spiral for declining mental state. 3 dots and a triangle for disappearance. In her private quarters, she maintained a hidden collection of personal items from vanished children. A spoon engraved with Leah's name. A locket containing red hair. Physical proof that these girls had existed and mattered. But Miriam's most dangerous discovery came when she began to map the institution's hidden spaces. Bellhaven's public face was that of a reformatory institution designed to provide moral education for troubled girls. But beneath this facade lay a complex network of hidden chambers, secret passages and underground spaces that served no educational purpose. Miriam's investigation began when she noticed inconsistencies in the building's layout. Corridors that should have connected to specific rooms ended at blank walls. Staircases descended further than the building's visible foundation should have allowed. Most tellingly, girls who were taken for special correction disappeared for days at a time despite the dormitories showing no evidence of empty beds. The hidden infrastructure of Bellhaven revealed the institution's true purpose. Not the reformation of troublesome children, but their systematic elimination. The correction chambers were only the beginning of a process that descended through multiple levels of psychological and physical destruction. Behind the chapel's altar, concealed by heavy velvet curtains, lay a door with no handle or visible lock, only an inverted cross carved faintly into its wooden surface. This door opened onto a spiral staircase that descended far below the building's apparent foundation, leading to chambers that existed on no architectural plan and served no purpose that could be publicly acknowledged. Miriam's exploration of these hidden spaces revealed the full scope of Bellhaven's operations. The cleansing room with its scorched metal basin and iron hooks was designed for rituals that combined religious symbolism with psychological torture. The chamber of stillness, lined with sealed recesses the size of coffins, served as the final destination for children, whose resistance could not be broken through conventional means. But perhaps most horrifying was the reflection garden, a fenced area behind the institution where the earth was unnaturally flat and grey, where nothing grew, and where careful excavation revealed the systematic burial of dozens of small bodies. The destruction of Bellhaven in 1890 allowed investigators to recover portions of Mother Calvina's complete theological writings, including sections of The Light in the Vessel that had never been read aloud to the children. These documents reveal a philosophy that used religious language to justify systematic child abuse on a scale that shocked even hardened investigators. Calvina's theology divided children into 2 categories: soul-bearers who could respond to conventional correction, and hollow-borns who required what she called reconstruction through suffering. This distinction wasn't based on behavior or moral character. It was a pseudo-scientific classification system that provided justification for treating certain children as inherently disposable. The recovered writings describe a liminal threshold, a psychological breaking point where a child's soul would either emerge purified or collapse entirely. Reaching this threshold wasn't an unfortunate side effect of correction. It was the deliberate goal of every intervention. Children who crossed into compliance were considered successfully reformed. Those who died or disappeared in the process were classified as spiritually incompatible with earthly existence. One preserved passage reads, "There are no innocents, only clay in varying degrees of stiffness. If the kiln of pain cannot soften them, they were never meant for heaven." Another states, "Speech is the enemy of salvation. The unbroken tongue preserves the ego. We must unmake the self to invite the light." This wasn't punishment disguised as education. It was deliberate psychological destruction disguised as spiritual salvation. Every aspect of Bellhaven's operations was designed to systematically strip away the components of human identity, memory, self-expression, bodily autonomy and hope. Calvina's methodology followed what she called the triad of refinement, a 3-stage process designed to completely reconstruct a child's personality according to institutional requirements. Stage 1 involved isolation, designed to strip away external identity markers. Children were separated from personal belongings, assigned new names and forbidden from referencing their lives before Bellhaven. This stage could last weeks or months, depending on the child's resistance to identity modification. Stage 2 employed sensory deprivation to dissolve psychological defenses. Children who continued to assert individual will were subjected to prolonged confinement in lightless, soundproof chambers where they lost track of time, space, and eventually their sense of self. Food deprivation and temperature manipulation accelerated the psychological breakdown process. Stage 3, euphemistically called sacred guidance,
involved the direct reconstruction of personality according to institutional specification. Children who survived the first 2 stages emerged as compliant shells, their former selves effectively erased and replaced with programmed responses to authority. The system tracked each child's progress through coded symbols rather than names. A soft sun indicated successful compliance. An open flame marked continued resistance. A pile of ash designated children who had reached the final stage, those whose resistance had proven irremediable, and who required permanent removal from the program. Children marked with the ash symbol were transferred to the Chamber of Stillness, where they were entombed alive in individual stone recesses. This wasn't execution in any conventional sense. It was what Calvina's writings describe as return to light by private right, a ritualized process of making inconvenient children disappear while maintaining the fiction that they had achieved spiritual transcendence. In the deepest chamber beneath Bellhaven's chapel, Miriam discovered an artifact that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A small iron music box that didn't play music. Instead, it contained a recording device, a technological innovation that shouldn't have existed in a remote Virginia institution. The device contained Leah's voice, preserved through some early form of audio recording technology that Calvina had apparently acquired for purposes of documenting her experimental procedure. The recording was brief, crackling with age and mechanical distortion, but unmistakably the voice of the 9-year-old girl who had refused to surrender her identity. If you hear this, then maybe I mattered. I tried. I bit. I sang. I wrote. They took Ruth's tongue, but not her. They buried hope, but not her song. We're still here. Don't let them win. The recording revealed that even in her final moments, Leah had maintained her sense of self and her concern for the other children who had suffered alongside her. Her message wasn't a plea for rescue. She understood that rescue wouldn't come. Instead, it was a demand for remembrance, the insistence that the children of Bellhaven not be allowed to disappear without acknowledgement. The existence of the recording device also raised disturbing questions about the scope of Bellhaven's operation. The technology required to create such recordings was expensive and rare, suggesting that the institution had financial backing and technical resources that extended far beyond a local religious community. Someone with significant wealth and influence had been supporting Calvina's experiments in systematic child destruction. As Miriam continued her investigation, she discovered evidence that Bellhaven wasn't an isolated institution, but part of a larger network of facilities operating throughout the post-Civil War South. Correspondence recovered from Calvina's private papers revealed communication with similar institutions in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia, all using variations of the same theological justifications for systematic child abuse. These institutions shared resources, methodologies, and even children. Girls who proved resistant at one facility could be transferred to another for more intensive correction. The network operated under various names: schools for moral improvement, institutes for wayward youth, convents for spiritual purification, but all followed versions of Calvina's doctrine of calibrated cruelty. The correspondence also revealed the existence of wealthy patrons who funded these operations while maintaining complete public distance from them. Prominent businessmen, politicians, and religious leaders contributed significant sums to support what they viewed as necessary social engineering, the elimination of children whose existence challenged conventional social structure. One recovered letter from an unnamed benefactor explicitly states, "The weak-minded and morally deficient must be prevented from corrupting future generations. Your methods, while necessarily harsh, serve the greater good of social preservation." This wasn't random violence against children. It was systematic elimination disguised as moral education, funded by people who believed that certain children were inherently disposable, and that society would benefit from their removal. By 1889, Miriam had documented enough evidence to expose Bellhaven's operations to outside authority, but she faced a problem that countless whistleblowers throughout history have encountered. The very people with the power to stop the abuse were often the same people who had enabled it to begin. Local law enforcement received funding from Bellhaven's benefactor. Religious authorities had publicly endorsed Calvina's theological innovations. Government officials had praised the institution's success in reducing the burden of problematic children on local communities. Exposing Bellhaven meant exposing a network of complicity that reached into every level of Virginia society. The children who had died within its walls weren't just victims of one woman's twisted theology. They were casualties of a social system that had deliberately chosen to dispose of them. Miriam's solution was both simple and devastating. She decided to let the children speak for themselves, working with the few remaining girls who still possessed enough independence to understand her plan. Miriam began a campaign of systematic resistance designed to make Bellhaven's operations impossible to ignore or deny. Names of disappeared children appeared carved into walls throughout the building. Mirrors that had been covered for years were suddenly found uncovered, reflecting images that no one wanted to see. The chapel's carefully maintained atmosphere of oppressive silence was broken by the sound of children singing, not hymns of submission, but songs of defiance. Most dramatically, 43 candles appeared on the chapel altar one morning, each one burning for a child who had vanished within Bellhaven's walls. When the sisters attempted to extinguish them, they immediately relit. When they tried to remove them, new candles appeared in their place. The institution's carefully constructed facade of spiritual authority began to crumble as the evidence of its crimes became impossible to suppress. Children who had been silent for years began to speak. Girls who had forgotten their own names suddenly remembered that the systematic psychological destruction that Bellhaven had perfected was being reversed by the simple act of acknowledgement. Bellhaven burned on a cold night in February 1890, but not from any external source. The fire began in the chapel, spreading from the 43 memorial candles that had become a permanent fixture despite all attempts to remove them. Witnesses reported that the flames seemed to follow specific patterns, consuming the building's administrative records while leaving evidence of its crimes intact. The dormitories burned first, then the administrative offices, then the chapel itself. But the foundation remained, along with the hidden chambers and underground passages that contained the physical evidence of Bellhaven's true purpose. The fire exposed what the institution had tried to hide, creating archaeological record that would eventually tell the complete story of what had happened within its wall. Most of the children were evacuated before the flames reached the residential areas, but the sisters scattered like shadows, disappearing into the night without attempting to save the institution's records or assist with the evacuation. Mother Calvina herself vanished completely. Some witnesses claimed to see her walking calmly into the forest as the building burned behind her, while others insisted she had never left the chapel and must have perished in the flame.
No body was ever found. No grave was ever marked. Calvina Moore simply ceased to exist, as definitively as the children she had erased, leaving behind only the evidence of her crimes and the haunted foundation of the institution she had built. In the weeks following the fire, something unprecedented happened in the reflection garden, where dozens of children had been buried in unmarked graves. Flowers began to bloom in soil that had been barren for 30 years. Not just a few scattered blooms, but hundreds of flowers in colors that shouldn't have been possible in Virginia's winter climate. White roses for innocence lost, yellow daffodils for hope that refused to die, purple violets for the courage of children who had resisted until their final moments. The flowers grew in perfect circles, marking the exact locations where bodies had been buried, creating a natural memorial that no human hand could have designed. The blooms persisted through winter, spring and summer, multiplying rather than wilting, spreading beyond the garden's iron fence to claim more and more of the surrounding forest. Attempts to remove them failed. New flowers appeared overnight to replace any that were picked or destroyed. Local residents, who had spent decades avoiding the area they called the Old Dark Patch, began to visit the spontaneous memorial. They brought their own flowers, their own candles, their own whispered apologies for failing to ask the right questions when those questions might have saved lives. The flowers continue to bloom today, more than a century after Bellhaven's destruction, marking a place where children died but refusing to let their memory die with them. The archaeological evidence: when Bellhaven's site was purchased by a private trust in the 1920s, construction crews attempted to demolish the remaining foundation and build new structures on the land. Their efforts met with immediate and inexplicable problems. Machinery broke down without mechanical cause. Drill bits overheated when they contacted certain areas of the foundation. Most significantly, the hidden chamber system proved impossible to breach or fill. One worker, interviewed anonymously decades later, described the experience. "We dug 30 feet down, found nothing but empty spaces and carved stone. No bodies, no artifacts, but the walls hummed, like something was still alive down there." Another reported, "There were names carved into the dirt itself, and every time we cleared them away they came back deeper and clearer than before." Eventually the construction company poured concrete over the entire area, but the ground refused to settle. Cracks appeared in geometric patterns that resembled the layout of Bellhaven's hidden chambers. During certain weather conditions, visitors reported hearing sounds from beneath the concrete. Not quite voices, not quite music, but something that carried the rhythm of half-remembered song. Modern archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed the complete scope of Bellhaven's underground infrastructure. The images show a complex network of chambers, passages and spaces that extend far beyond what the building's visible foundation suggests. Most mysteriously, the surveys indicate areas of organized space that don't correspond to any known construction techniques from the technology exists to excavate these spaces and potentially recover additional evidence of what happened at Bellhaven, but legal restrictions and property rights have prevented such investigation. The site remains private property, officially protected as a historical preserve, but effectively sealed against outside examination. Ria Langley's discovery of the original map in 2022 launched the first systematic investigation of Bellhaven in over a century. Working with historians, archaeologists and genealogists, she began piecing together the complete story of the institution and its victims. Her research revealed that Bellhaven wasn't unique. Similar institutions operated throughout the post-Civil War period, often in remote locations where their operations could proceed without oversight. The network of moral improvement schools, spiritual reform institutes, and corrective facilities processed thousands of children whose only crime was failing to conform to narrow social expectations. Most of these institutions left no records of their operations, but Bellhaven's sudden destruction and the subsequent preservation of its foundation created an unprecedented archive of evidence. The recovered documents, artifacts, and architectural remains provide the most complete picture available of how systematic child abuse was institutionalized, funded, and justified in 19th century America. Langley's team also began the process of identifying Bellhaven's victims through genealogical research and family records. Many of the children had been sent to the institution by families who believed they were providing necessary moral correction for difficult daughters. The families received regular reports claiming that their children were making spiritual progress, never knowing that the girls had died or disappeared months earlier. The investigation has identified 43 confirmed victims, and suggests that the actual number may be significantly higher. Each identified child has been researched individually, their family histories documented, their short lives remembered in detail that Bellhaven's records deliberately obscure. Perhaps most remarkably, Langley's investigation located 3 elderly women, whose family histories suggested possible connections to Bellhaven. Through careful genealogical detective work and DNA analysis, she confirmed that these women were descendants of girls who had somehow survived the institution's systematic destruction process. Their family stories, passed down through generations as fragmented memories and half-understood warnings, provided crucial corroboration for the evidence recovered from Bellhaven's ruin. The stories spoke of grandmothers who couldn't bear to hear church bells, of great-grandmothers who refused to allow mirrors in their homes, of women who would never speak about their childhoods, but would wake screaming from dreams they couldn't remember. One descendant shared a family tradition of lighting candles on certain dates for the girls who couldn't come home. Another described a grandmother who obsessively tended a garden of white flowers and would sometimes whisper names to the blooms as if they could hear her. A third family maintained a collection of small personal items, a broken rosary, a torn ribbon, a wooden ring, that had supposedly belonged to the lost sister. These family memories, preserved across multiple generations despite their painful associations, provided the missing context for understanding how Bellhaven's operations affected not just its direct victims but entire family lines. The trauma didn't end with the children who died within the institution's walls. It echoed through decades of survivors who carried the psychological scars of their experiences and the guilt of their survival. The story of Bellhaven Institute for Wayward Girls didn't end with its destruction. The building burned, the perpetrators scattered, and the victims were buried in unmarked graves. But the fundamental questions raised by its existence remain as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. How does a society decide which children are worth protecting, and which are disposable? What happens when religious authority is used to justify systematic abuse? How do institutions designed to help vulnerable populations transform into mechanisms for their destruction? These questions echo through modern debates about juvenile justice, residential treatment facilities, and the rights of children in institutional care. Bellhaven's methodology of systematic psychological destruction has been refined and updated, but variations of its approach continue to appear in institutions around the world. The children who died at Bellhaven weren't victims of random violence or individual pathology. They were casualties of a social system that had identified them as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. Their deaths were preventable, but prevention would have required adults to ask uncomfortable questions about the institutions they trusted
and the authorities they supported. Perhaps the most important lesson from Bellhaven's history comes not from its perpetrators, but from its victims. Children like Leah M., who maintained their sense of self despite systematic attempts to erase them, demonstrate the remarkable resilience of human identity in the face of deliberate destruction. Leah's journal, hidden behind a stone wall for more than a century, represents more than historical documentation. It's a testament to the power of witness, the importance of memory, and the refusal to disappear quiet. Her final message, preserved on a mechanical recording device, continues to challenge anyone who learns her story. Don't let them win. The children of Bellhaven didn't have advocates powerful enough to save them, but they found ways to ensure that their stories would eventually be told. They carved their names into hidden spaces, preserved personal items as evidence of their existence, and somehow managed to communicate across more than a century to demand acknowledgement for their suffering. Their resistance succeeded in ways they could never have imagined. The institution designed to erase them became instead a monument to their persistence. The building meant to silence them ultimately amplified their voices. The systematic destruction intended to make them disappear created instead an permanent record of their courage. Ria Langley's research into Bellhaven continues today, expanding beyond the single institution to examine the broader network of facilities that operated during the same period. Her work has identified at least 12 similar institutions across the southeastern United States, all sharing variations of the same theological justifications and methodological approaches. The investigation has also revealed the continued existence of financial trusts and property holdings connected to Bellhaven's original benefactors. Families whose ancestors funded the institution's operations continue to own property in the area, and some maintain legal restrictions that prevent full archaeological investigation of potential burial sites. This modern dimension of the Bellhaven story raises additional questions about accountability, restitution, and the ongoing responsibility of institutions and individuals whose predecessors enabled systematic child abuse. The victims of Bellhaven have been dead for more than a century, but their stories continue to demand justice that has never been provided. Recent developments include efforts to have the Bellhaven site designated as a national memorial, legal challenges to property restrictions that prevent complete archaeological investigation, and genealogical research aimed at identifying additional victims and connecting with their surviving family members. Today, visitors to the Bellhaven site find a landscape that refuses to forget what happened there. The Reflection Garden, where 43 children were buried in unmarked graves, continues to produce flowers that shouldn't be able to grow in its soil. The blooms appear year-round, thriving in conditions that kill other vegetation, multiplying rather than diminishing over time. The flowers have spread beyond the original garden boundaries, claiming more and more of the surrounding forest. Hikers report encountering unexpected clusters of blooms in areas where no seeds should have taken root, often arranged in patterns that suggest deliberate placement rather than natural growth. Some visitors report experiencing auditory phenomena near the flower beds, not quite voices, not quite music, but something that carries the rhythm of half-remembered lullabies and playground song. Others describe a sensation of being watched, not threateningly but protectively, as if the area is under the guardianship of invisible sentinels who want to ensure that no harm comes to anyone who visits respectfully. The flowers serve as a living memorial to children whose names were deliberately erased from official records but who refuse to be forgotten. Each bloom represents a life that mattered, a story that deserves to be told, a voice that demands to be heard across the century. The story of Bellhaven Institute for Wayward Girls challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies treat their most vulnerable members. It reminds us that systematic abuse doesn't happen in isolation. It requires networks of enablers, systems of justification, and cultures of willful ignorance that allow atrocities to continue unexamined. But the story also demonstrates the power of truth to survive even the most determined attempts at suppression. Mother Calvina Moore designed Bellhaven to eliminate inconvenient children without leaving traces of their existence. She created elaborate theological justifications for systematic murder. She built hidden chambers and secret passages to hide her crimes. She destroyed official records and silenced potential witnesses. Yet her efforts at concealment ultimately failed. The children she tried to erase found ways to preserve their stories. The building she designed to hide atrocities became an archaeological record of her crimes. The theological doctrines she created to justify abuse became evidence of her systematic cruelty. Most importantly, the children of Bellhaven succeeded in their fundamental demand. They refused to be forgotten. Their names, hidden in carved letters and secret journals, survived to be spoken again. Their voices, preserved in mechanical recordings and family memories, continued to testify across generations. Their graves, unmarked by human hands, marked themselves with flowers that bloom eternally. In the end, Bellhaven Institute for Wayward Girls stands as both a warning and a warning about what happens when society fails to protect its children, and a promise that truth, however deeply buried, will eventually claw its way back to the surface. The children are still there, beneath the forest floor, beneath the concrete, beneath the silence that was supposed to erase them forever. They're still there, and they're still speaking to anyone willing to listen to voices that refuse to be silenced. Don't let them win. Before we end this investigation, it's important to speak the names that Bellhaven tried so hard to erase. These children existed. They mattered. They deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or symbols, but as individual human beings, whose lives were cut short by systematic cruelty disguised as moral education. Leo M., who refused to surrender her identity and hid her story where it would eventually be found. Ruth, who sang without a tongue, and whose courage inspired others to resist. Hope H., who wore a golden lamb pendant and disappeared after only 3 weeks. Evangeline, Clara, June, Dust, Obedience, Grace and Stillness. Virtue, names assigned to real girls whose birth names were deliberately forgotten, and 33 others whose names appear in fragments on carved stones, stitched fabrics and hidden documents. 33 children, whose individual stories may never be fully recovered, but whose collective testimony continues to challenge us across the centuries. They were 9 years old, and 10 and 12. They loved music and mirrors and the feeling of writing their real names in secret places. They feared the dark and the cold and the sound of footsteps approaching their beds at night. They hoped for rescue that never came and families who never learned what happened to them. They were children. They deserved protection and education and the chance to grow up and make their own choices about who they wanted to become. Instead, they became victims of adults who decided their lives were worth less than social conformity. But they also became something their killers never intended. They became witnesses whose testimony transcends death. They became voices that speak across generations to warn us about the price of silence and the importance of asking difficult questions about the institutions we trust. They became proof that love is stronger than hate, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that some things, like the courage of children who refuse to surrender their names, are too important to be erased by any human hand. In the reflection garden where their bodies rest, flowers continue to bloom in impossible colors, creating beauty from soil that was meant to hide horrors. The flowers grow without tending, multiply without planting, and persist through seasons that should kill them. Just like the children they commemorate, the flowers refuse to be silenced. Just like the truth they represent, they will not be erased. And just like the memories they preserve, they continue to speak to anyone willing to listen to voices that transcend death itself. The children of Bellhaven are still there, beneath the flowers, beneath the forest, beneath the silence that was supposed to be their final punishment. They're still there, and they're still speaking. Don't let them win.